Welcome everybody to be here this morning.
An opportunity for everybody to better understand the reality of the two communities. And there are two guests who know this very well are from the region of Battleford and Western Saskatchewan in general. So I'd like to introduce Ghislain Bellavance, born in North Battleford. He was young. He joined the army at a young age. He had a very substantial military career. From 1987, he was commissioner of the National Parole Board, which he did for 11 years. Since then, he's been president of the Historical Society of the Battleford, a member of the board of the historical architecture of the province. He's been very active. He was a citizen of North Battleford. So, Mr. Gilbert Bellavance.
So we're pleased to have with us today Cecile Blanke, with maiden name was Larocque and Trottier. She was born in Lac Pelletier, south of Swift Current. She farmed for 25 years with her family. She's a well-respected Métis Elder, and she has been working in community college part of her life. And now she's teaching about the Métis culture and history in the schools to the students. And she has many relatives in the area, because as some people may know that there's been a lot of migration from Swift Current to the north here in some part of the history. So please welcome Cecile Blanke.
So this is a presentation, one after the other, and then we'll have some exchanges about their thoughts on the two communities.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here on such a beautiful day. And this gathering of Métis and French is the first for me. And what I have to say, I hope will be beneficial for all of you to hear. So I will let my partner start, and I will follow.
Good morning, everyone. For those that don't understand French, you had better get your translation material, because I'm going to give, of course, my presentation in French. Allow me to stand, please, because there's a few injuries from my army days, and I stiffen out fairly fast when I'm sitting on a cold chair. The beauties of electronics, etc.
A bit about myself. Why you ask? Why have I asked this guy to speak? It's very easy to. My grandfather was a Trois Pistoles in Quebec. He came to St. Boniface in 1880, and when he met somebody from Quebec called L'Heureux, they talked a bit about the region for west of St. Boniface. And L'Heureux talked about his brother-in-law who had already come to Battleford. And so my grandfather decided with L'Heureux to, after the events of 1885, to come and set up in the region. The brother-in-law of Mr. L'Heureux became the brother-in-law of my grandfather, because L'Heureux and Bellavance got married their daughters. So Georges Pichette, the brother-in-law, who had been since 1878, had worked with for Father Cochin, pound maker, and who had followed really the Bredner family, which had come from St. Boniface. And later I understood why they followed the Bredner family. After the events of 1985, George B. had married, so they set up near Delmas. So on my grandfather's side, they settled north of the lake, about 4 or 5 French Canadian families. Eventually, they moved to Battleford. My grandmother was not well, and so they got closer to a doctor. And the Father Cochin convinced them to settle near his mission, which is now Delmas. Not far from there was a person called Joe Poitras, who just settled in the area, and Georges Pichette came to settle near them. And that began the heart of the French Canadian community in Delmas. My mother's side, she was European, came from Belgium. Her father came from Luxembourg, and so already I begin to be a bit of a mixture myself. And that brings us now to the fact that my father was born where Delmas is now, and the first white baby of the location, the second to be baptized in the Delmas mission. So a little bit of history. You would be surprised to know that being president of the Historical Society of Battleford, I talk to you a bit about history. The history of the Battlefords begins near 1895-97. Not a large number of Francophones came with the RCMP and with the government, because Battleford had been named the capital of the Northwest Territories, and also because with the telegraph, which came set up in 1975 near the Battle River and across the prairies. And I think that of a few names, well-known names, Francophones who came at this time, Forget, who was administrator with the government, who became the first lieutenant governor of Saskatchewan, and Albert Champagne, who had the hotel, a little hotel to start off with. He became the first mayor of Battleford, and among others, there were people who provided essential services. That was, at the time, that was horseshoes. You absolutely had to have a few Francophones. L'Heureux, who came from the north of the lake, but one who was settled east of here, who came with the police, with the RCMP, the mounted police. So there was just a group. A core group of Francophones in Battleford, and between 1878 and 1883, 1884. Naturally, you have to remember that at that time, to help and to encourage people to come here, you had to mention the Oblate Fathers. The Oblate Fathers in the region at that time. Cochin was one, Father Lacombe, not the one from Alberta, but his nephew, and others encouraged people to come and settle in the region. The parish of St. Vital Parish in Battleford was set up in 1897, and already in 83, when you look at the records of the parish, you can see about 150 people in the parish, and it says of 115 spoke French or Métis. So already the community, the French Francophone community, which included all the Métis, were in the majority in the parish. So that's changed a lot since then. So I'm going to stop there to tell you that already it was a complete representation of French Canadians at Battleford.
I will give you a shot, madame.
I won't stand. I've got arthritis in my knee, so I will do my speech in sitting down. Myself, I'm a Métis Elder because I'm 75 years old and I'm the oldest Métis in Swift Current and in the area. All of my ancestors have died and or moved away, so our family tree has dwindled very much. The Métis and its beginning, when Champlain came to Canada in the early 1500s, he took an Indian woman, then their children were mixed blood, which were Métis, or what was called half-breed. From there, the trend went on westward. My roots of a Métis and a lot of others goes back to my grandmother, born at the Red River, Manitoba. Her grandfather was from Quebec. He came west and married a Cree. There were thousands of Métis that lived at the Red River. When the political unrest came in the 1870s, the Métis moved westward to Saskatchewan, Alberta, North Dakota, and Montana. They settled in many parts of Saskatchewan. Everywhere there was a food source, game, fish, because there was no more buffalo. My great-grandparents and their children, Baptiste, came and settled at Lake Pelletier Valley in 1870s, south of Swift Current. The valley is a beautiful valley. We always hear from so many people, and especially Albertans, they say, there's nothing in Saskatchewan but flat prairie. And we always say, we have beautiful places, places that you've never been. We don't have mountains, but we have a lot of other good things. The valley had coulees, deep coulees, and each coulee had a spring. So the Métis had learned to make gardens and make hay and had horses for traveling. So they settled in the valley and there was game there, of course, to live on, and they made their gardens. So they had sustainable food since there was no more buffalo. They raised a few cattle, chickens, and whatever. And they were what you might call small farmers, but they didn't own much land. They got scrip from the government, but most of them couldn't read or write. So they were swindled out of their scripts because they didn't know how to handle their scripts, and there was policies that went with the scripts. So a lot of the people in the valley had scripts, but they all lost them. And the valley is about, it starts really in Swift Current and goes all the way to Notre Dame, which is Pontex today. So the valley was full of Métis. In the early 1900s, there was around 200 to 300 people that lived there because we all had large families. And we didn't have no schools and we didn't have no church. But in 1905 and 6, we had Father Passaplan that came from Willabunch. And he was born in Switzerland. And he came to be with the Métis, and he understood their language, and he went hunting with them. So he was he was like our God, you might say. My dad cherished him, and he said, if Passaplan would have stayed here, we would have had even a school in the valley. Passeplan had, in 1906 and 7, lived in a cave. And that's where we went to church. Not me, myself. And the few early ranchers that came, and at the time there was very few French people there. And that was 1906 and 7. And then the French came in 1910. And they created a village that's called Lake Pelletier. But Lake Pelletier was named after the first homesteader. In 1886, he had homesteaded at the north end of the lake. So the village took his name also. From there, that's where we had to go to church and get married or baptized or whatever, or buried. And before that, when there was no priest, our burials were on the top of the hills, all the way along the valley. So today I tell people, if you think there's a grave there, don't dig it up. There is nothing there. The Métis came with hardly anything, and they left with nothing. The valley had springs, and the lake had lots of fish. Mr. Lemire came from Montana, and he stopped and camped there in 1865. And he noticed in the lake there was these beautiful white fish. So he got the fish, then he went back to Montana, and he brought his family there. So we have been there since 1865. But then when things changed, after the settlers came in, that's when the French came, and they were on the east side and the west side of the lake, of the valley. So that's our beginning with the French. But first of all, I'll have to tell you about my grandmother. She was a Trutchy, and she lived with her parents, but she encountered a friendship with my grandpa, which was Leo Larocque from La Brette. So he came one summer, because his brother was a mailman from the Saskatchewan landing to Battleford. And anyway, he came to the valley and flirted with my grandmother, and he got her pregnant. So my old grandma, my great grandma, we called her Little Grandma, and they went by horse and buggy all the way from Swift Current to La Brette, and to get their man. They got to La Brette, and there was two Larocque farms, one in the valley and one on top of the hill. So my grandfather was hiding. When she was down in the valley, he was up at the top, and vice versa. And it took 3 days before she got her man. And then they came back, and they settled at the Saskatchewan landing. Because my grandfather was a freighter with his dad, my great-grandfather freighted from Minneapolis to Lac La Biche. So they knew all about traveling. And so they lived there for a while, and they got typhoid fever. So they lost how many children? And that terrified my grandmother. So she went back to Lake Pelletier Valley to be with her mother, because that really scared her. And they never moved back to the river, so they always lived in the valley. to join all the other Métis people and families. In them days, the Métis were well established. Most of them were squatters and didn't own land. But when we started then in 1910, of course, the schools sprung up. But before that, there was no schools. So the missionary priests from Lebret decided this would be a good way to get more students. So they came by wagon from Swift Current and gathered all the Métis kids from the Lake Pelletier Valley. And anybody from 7 years old and to whatever age. And that was to fill their amount. And that was all politics also. When the residential school was built at Lebret, it was for Indians. We called them Indians at that time. So the Métis came in to fill their numbers because they didn't have a full enrollment. But when the officials came around to look, they said they hid because a lot of the Métis were whiter than the Indians, so they didn't want the government to know they had Métis there. So way back then, everything was political, and so is it today. And anyway, they went by wagon and took them to Swift Current, and then they took the train, and they went all the way to to Lebret. They never were allowed to come home. My cousin Louise Moyne Truchy, she wrote a book that's called My Life in the Residential School. And she was there for 7 years. And some of the stuff she told me, she lived to 101, and it wasn't a very pretty picture. She said they starved us there, and I was called a skinny baboon because I was so skinny. She said I was just never had any fat or meat anywhere. And of course the schools were run by priests and nuns, and they lived a terrible life. My dad was there for 4 years, and he said if I didn't get out of there, I would have died. Because they were, the Métis could comprehend a lot faster than the Indians. So maybe they would be in class 2 hours a day, and the rest of the time they had to work. Because the Indians had to be in school maybe 8 hours compared to our 2 hours. Because they already knew some white ways of learning. So that's why they were abused by hard work and also their language. My dad said, if you had a brother or sister there, they wouldn't let you be in the same place because they didn't want you to get homesick, I guess, or to be close to anyone. Even if you were 7 years old, you had to tough it alone. So then, when they came back to the valley, they were very distorted because they didn't have our Métis background of bringing up. And that disrupted the whole Métis community because they were so deeply hurt. Today when you hear about the residential schools, sometimes you think, well, it wasn't that bad. And this cousin said, if we peed the bed at 7 years old, they tied the sheet all the way around your head and you wore that all day to smell this all day. And if they caught you speaking your language, they would put a needle in your tongue. So the punishment was great, and you were afraid. So you didn't even try to speak your brother or sister, or have any part of another Métis, because you were afraid of the punishment you would get. So that is what happened in the early days. I will let my partner take over.
And speaking of education, now is a good time to carry on with education in the region here. Here in Battleford, in the early years, particularly Father Bigotes tried to assemble the children in Battleford to teach them something. And it was almost an impossible task. A young lady came from Montreal who was called Miss Doral, who was a volunteer to establish a school in Battleford, and in '86 she began giving classes, and very quickly, in a year or two, it was one big class. There were 89 children in one room. There were no grades. It was just everybody learning at the same time. Some learned in French, some had no French, so she taught mathematics and whatever. And she did a huge amount of work. But in '86, Monsignor went to Nicolette and spoke to the Sisters of the Assumption and said, look, we really, really need you in Battleford to teach. So the sisters came in '86, liked what they saw, the organization, and formed, established a convent and schools, and since '86, a formal education or formal teaching started in Battleford. That is when, in those 15 years, around 77 and to 82, were beginning to be formed, like Damas and others in Gutscheklich. I'm just talking about those two because there were many of you who know more than I do the details of other communities. But I grew up in Delmas. The communities were established around the mission or the parish. Saint-Léon was already established in '86, '87, and Jacques Fish, and the mission in Delmas already existed even before the community was formed. In 1902, 1903, Lisette and Fanny was already established. There were several Francophones and Métis were at the head of the lake and near Jackfish. There were about 10 families between Upper Cellar and Delmas, and we were already thinking of education and establishing schools. Many of the families, and of course the Sisters of Assumption had the schools and the boarding school, and many people sent their children to Bedford to the convent for education. The sisters continued coming, and we see a convent being established in Delmas, north of Jackfish, and that area. And education started to have be established around the village. Many of the farmers, well, their lives were pretty much established between the farm and the village. It was always around the parish and the schools in the village. So those little communities became quite solid. In Battleford, what we see very quickly developing was with the expansion of Battleford and then of North Battleford, because the railroad was coming through on this side of the river. There was an expansion that took place fairly quickly in the early years of in the 1900s, and even looking in the Saint Vital archives, we saw that In 1905, some 300 people in the parish, 150 were of German background, and the other half was French, Métis, and Irish. So already within 15 to 20 years, the Francophone town in those two settlements were already in minority. Then, during the next few years, there were Francophones that left the town to join the other French communities that were very solid and well established. And during that time, we could pretty much do anything in those towns, those villages. There were doctors who lived in that area. I had a great uncle who had set up his practice in Dalmas in 1908, 1909, who served the Dalmas community and came all the way to Battleford. Did you know that on the Francophone side, there was a Saint Jean-Baptiste society that had been established in Battleford by the Francophones? In 1885, it was established. That society had its ups and downs during the years, but it functioned for over 30 years until the Francophone group in Battleford became much too few to maintain it. The priests and the sisters were increasing in the region. Even in Battleford, they came to establish a hospital. The North Battleford Hospital was established by the sisters, remained a very important hospital for many years. So after a while, it became difficult to obtain teaching to send your children to school in French. If 50 or 60 children did not speak French, it became very difficult to teach a general class. And in the villages, the teaching was entirely in French, following the curriculum that came out after Saskatchewan became a province. But the strength seemed to have been dispersed to the small communities from the larger one by then. Those little communities remained fairly solid through the 30s, even 40s. With the war, of course, a great number of our young men who went to war. My father went to war, and we then moved into the village. Many farmers just moved into the village. And those who stayed in the village or the town would go out to the farms to lend a hand to those who were still farming. The expansion was being manifested in the two towns of the Battlefords, and then there began to be an exodus from the villages, leaving the villages and coming into the town to work for essential services that were beginning to be needed. So the little communities started shifting into the town. And it became very difficult during that time. We were having pressure not to teach in French. And really, we had the right to teach 1 hour, possibly 2 hours of French teaching. And in the small villages, we still spoke French. But the inspectors would come to see how we made out and to make sure that we were following the English curriculum. So we were forced then with the ACFC, to follow the French courses after hours or during weekends. Myself, myself, I did my 12 years of studies in French with ACFC courses. It took a great deal of tenacity and strength and determination, not from from the children, but certainly from the parents. The children didn't like it. I had a mother who was pushing me. You are going to study this, like it or not. And here in town, it was hard to even have an hour of teaching. Politics favored centralization of all essential services, and certainly there just was no more room for French. It was discouraged outright. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to ask my colleague to continue, and we will see what happened after the war till the present, and I hope I'll be able to finish with that.
Over to you, Madame.
Well, I will go back to my school days. I went to the village school, which was French. So we had to speak French. We had to take French, and we didn't understand it. Our Michif language, we understood very well and could speak it, and the nouns in French and the verbs in Cree, and that's what the Michif language is. So when I went to school, I could understand, well, table, chair, desk, or writing board, or teacher, because that's how we address things in Michif. But that confused us very much, because we thought we had our own language. And here we were mixed with, partly with the French. And nobody explained that to us, why that language was such. And same with the church. Of course, we were all Catholics. That was from the Red River. And there was a priest there right from 1910 on. And everything was in French. So we would go to church, and church was an hour of preaching in French and maybe 15 to 20 minutes, 15 minutes in English. So we didn't get much out of the service except to sit quiet and be bored. And one funny thing I'll tell you was when we went to church, we couldn't afford to buy the seats. Downstairs was all paid seats, either so much a year or so much a month, I'm not sure. So we were sent to the balcony, and that's where the poor people went. So all the Métis were upstairs. And I'll tell you one funny thing. The choir and the organ was upstairs, and the choir was a bunch of young Francophones, and my dad could sleep even standing up, so he could sleep very easily. And we had wooden chairs with rungs on the back, and of course we were always dressed up, and my dad had a three-piece suit with a vest and a tightener in the back. Well, these young fellas, they took the fastener of his vest and tied it onto the rungs of the chair. So of course we did a lot of standing, kneeling, and sitting. So after the preaching was over, my dad went to stand up, and the chair came with him. Well, what a commotion that was. And the embarrassment on our part for him to try and get untangled. And that was worse than all the broncs he rode, and he was a bronc rider. So anyway, on the way home, he told my mother, "We're never going back to that church again." And so we didn't go, and soon the priest came, and he said, "You gotta come to church, because you're going to go to hell for sure, if you don't come to church. He said, I will fix that problem that you had. So the next Sunday we went, and right from the pulpit, the priest pointed his finger to those young guys in the back, and he said, if you ever touch Mr. Larocque again, you will never come back in this church. So they never played no more tricks on us. So that's why we always felt we were not a part of them. When we would come down the stairs, of course, all the French were outside, and they would all stare at us. And I know for myself, we came by horse and buggy. And we were the only ones, the Métis were the only ones that came with horse and buggy. The rest had cars. So they would look how we were dressed and how we looked, and so it was very degrading and very, if I said lots of times in my speeches, if there was a hole big enough in the ground, I'd have crawled in it. Because that's how we felt amongst the French. They never included us. There was lots of times in the village they would have meals after church or invitations for the cars would pile around to some of the residents, and we were never invited. We would go to our buggy and eat our bannock. And school was similar. If we took bannock to school, the kids would look in our lunch kits and we would make fun of us. So if mother didn't have bread, we refused to go to school. We just wouldn't go. And the school on the east side of the valley, which was Alec Little Bear, that was here last night, and they was enough Métis there. They went behind the barn to eat their lunches because then nobody made fun of them. So our hurts and our experience goes very deep. So for us to accept the Francophones, even to this day, I have a hard time thinking they are a part of us or we are part of them. And I would say, even today, the people I grew up with, they still are above me, I would say, even though I have a good husband, which we've been married 58 years, and I have just as good a home as any French body that lives around Swift Current or Lake Peltier. And yet I still have to look up to them because they always feel they are better than we are. And so for me, as an elder, teaching my Métis friends or whatever, I have a hard time telling them we should appreciate that we are part French. But I guess that's because of the politics, the priests, the nuns, and the school system, and that is why the hurts go very deep. And this happened all over the province. My great uncle, I had 7 great uncles, and they were all over in this province, and their name is Larocque. And they were freighters, they knew people all over. So all of their reports are still the same as mine. In any French community, they were never really accepted. They were always put down. So today, I can say, I have never had a Francophone come to me and say they're glad they're part of us. Never. And when that will ever change, I don't know. But you Francophones here can change that. Your children can change that. They can appreciate another Métis kid and tell them, yes, we are a nation, we are together, and our roots are from the same place. And that's my advice today to the Francophones here. For me, I probably am too old to not have the hurt there anymore. I have a lot of cousins up here. I was related to the Pritchards 3 ways, and I know in Battleford the Pritchards are very well known. So the old Pritchard was born at Lake Peltier. That was his roots. So that's where we all come from, a lot of us, Métis, around this province. So our roots are, you might say, all the same. So when I go to Métis meetings, I meet people from Batache, from Prince Albert, from all over, and we're all the same. The experiences have been the same. But I didn't come here just to tell you all my hurts. I think the French have been a very wonderful culture. They have very many qualities that we carried even. Like even our sash, that came from the French. It was called La Flashie. So by them, we learned a lot from them. And that is why I say we should say we appreciate the French, but we have a hard time because we've been hurt. And maybe through this century that can change. But from when Louis Riel lost the fight, we were defeated, not by the French, by the Canadian government. But that really set us back from going forward, which the French never experienced that kind of a battle, but I know they experienced other battles through French history. But that is why the Métis took so long to get going again. Our Métis nation was, or our Métis got recognized finally in 1982 that we became a Métis nation of Canada. And even our Métis anthem that was played here, it makes us really proud to hear that we have a Métis anthem. And so I hope you don't take this to heart that I hate you that are here. I really don't hate anybody. It's just we had a really hard time to accept the French culture. But today I have a granddaughter that's grade 12 and she's in French immersion. She could speak to you very well today. And I'm proud of her that she went all through this way. She will be graduating. And so it's not all that we don't want to be a part of this French. And so I hope that I haven't made a bad mark about myself or about you. I love all people, and I would say in my heart, I have forgiven everybody that has hurt me through the years, through church or through services or whatever my belief is in. I know there is good in all people, and I hope that when you leave here, that you have learned something from me.
Thank you, Madame. I would like to finish also by saying that we went through a period where the French was totally almost impossible to have here. And the change has been is that as your granddaughter is now in French immersion, is here to this day, we now have almost 700 children in French immersion or in French schools or learning French in this community. And slow but sure, instead of going back to the small communities, they're now coming back in here. And c'est la mode. C'est la mode de parler le français around here. I'd like to finish by saying that I didn't have some of those experiences, of course. I grew up with a lot of Métis cousins. And I forgive my Métis cousin because when I was 10 years old, it was a beautiful little Métis cousin girl that I had decided I was going to marry. And she just looked at me and said, no. And to this day, I have a broken heart from a little Métis girl who married a guy in Lloydminster, of all things. Anyway, I wanted to finish off by saying, why did I come here? The main reason is because, yes, I'm interested. I've come here because I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn and understand. And I'm very, very pleased to have met you and to have listened to the background of the Métis. And yes, I think the future is, fortunately, in our grandchildren. And Madame, thank you very, very much for being part of this. And I thank all of you for listening to us. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I thank you for being my partner and understanding. Anybody want to ask me a question, I would be willing to answer.
Do you have any questions? Please ask them.
So if you have a question, could I have 5 minutes? Oui?
I would like to hear some Michif. Are you still able to express yourself?
Yeah.
Kimietin Pixweanota Anush. Limi Chief, we pehtoja ota to come together.
D'autres questions? Other question?
I come from northern Saskatchewan, a place called Green Lake. In English, it's called Green Lake. In French, it's Lac Vert. And in Cree, it's Agogapusageg. It's the same community. Back in the late 40s and early 50s, a bunch of Métis, displaced Métis, were moved to Green Lake. They came from communities such as Punachai, Lestock, Glen Mary, Eagle Hills, around Kinnesno, places like that. You look awfully familiar. Did you ever come to Green Lake?
No, I didn't, but I know where it is. I had a daughter that nursed in Beauval, so I've been to Buffalo Narrows. I was president of the Métis Society for 5 years in the 70s. So I even went to Ottawa to speak to the government. And today I am president of Pontex, which is a French community. And a lot of the French are dwindling in the South because most of us only have 1 or 2 children. So, but the Métis, that is not so. A lot of Métis still have large families. So that is why the Francophones and the whites is getting less. But the Métis have not. If you listen to the government with numbers of First Nation and Métis, we are growing. And that is why I think the French Francophones, are not as many as they used to be. Maybe they are more up here, have larger families, but not in the south. Not Pontex, Gravelburg, Willowbunch, all of those communities that, proclaim to be mostly French. They are not, like I say, Lake Pelletier, the village, there is one person left in that village. There used to be a store, a church, a rectory, and the school. And there is no French left there at all. There's big farmers, they have taken over all the land. There's hardly any French left there at all. And so that is why the disappearing of the Francophones in the South has taken place just like the Métis did at Lake Pelletier.
Maybe a last question, une dernière question ou deux.
Mr. Bellavance, you say that now is the fashion here to have French. Could you explain what you mean by that? I know that we have already known this kind of taste for French, but recently, as things are changing, seriously, talking of fashion, it's a little bit like it begins in a small way. In training here, in having a French school in the 60s, and then with a lot of problems, a lot of battles. In the end, the school board, the public school board, took on the French school and set up the Notre Dame school. In 2 or 3 years, it was overflowing. So they bought another school, a bigger school, and then they sold the school. The Monsignor Blaise Morin's school. It's already overflowing. So the public school board began to have plans for French immersion. And once fashionable, it begins a small group, a core group of children who have teaching in French, and a lot of people were against it. And I had a meeting. There was a meeting where there were people my age and a little older who said that wasn't going well at all. Now you don't hear them say that anymore. Because why? Because even on the English-speaking side, many of their grandchildren are at the immersion school. So when I see it's the fashion to speak French, it became fashion to be, well, I have grandchildren in French. And when I say that's fashionable, it's not the case everywhere. But 700 children who are learning French over the last few years now, that represents a big change. Well, is that going to continue? That depends on us. We have to support this. We have a lot more support now. We have a cultural center. We have immersion schools. We have the Fransaskois School Board, and that depends on us to ensure that this continues and to help our children to keep the language. But it's saying it's the fashion, and at one point it was the fashion not to speak French. So there's been a good change. That's what I wanted to say. For the future, I'm fairly optimistic because I've seen the changes. Naturally, that's going to depend on our people, on our young people, and I've spent a lot of years everywhere, and I've seen many communities disappear because of the war, because of all kinds of things, and Madame was saying, if we don't have any children, well, all is going to fall apart. So again, I'm too old now to help, but if my wife was here, I get a slap. But we've got to the point now with a good mix. And when I think of the children and children and grandchildren, I have a French basis. One of my grandparents came from Luxembourg and spoke German before speaking French. For my wife's side, it was English, Scottish, with a German grandmother. My children married here and there. My children don't have much French, except for one of them. But my grandchildren all speak French. And I have 4 great-grandchildren, and 2 are in French school. So that comes back. It's coming back. And that's why I say there's hope. And have I answered your question? Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I would say, us in the Western provinces, I think we have a big concern about our French or any language. When you see the different cultures that have come into our country, and they are very strong, and they are really pushing. So will Quebec be pushed farther and farther away from us? And other languages come in? You go to Vancouver, and what do you see there? You go to Calgary, what do you see there? So these other cultures are really strong, and they are pushing their way. So if we don't keep strong in our cultures, we're going to be pushed out of the way in a hurry. For myself, I went to this French school. I went 5 years, and I was still in grade 2 because the French language gave me trouble. So then my grandparents moved to Swift Current, and I went to school there. I got to grade 7, and I was married at 16, so I quit school because my parents had parted because of alcohol, and that was during the war, after the war. So I married my husband at 16, but in later years, I took my GED, so I have grade 12 and GED. So I know how to write and read and to communicate. So through the years, we have 6 children. I have encouraged them all our years to get their education. But they didn't go to French schools, so they didn't get they got French maybe 2 years in high school, but that was it. So that's why I'm telling you, Francophones, you better be pushing too, if we're going to stay in this country. Thank you.
Yes.
See, I looked at the building, and I had this thought. In the 50s, when I was finishing school here, and I was a math teacher, a Francophone math teacher, Métis, a mathematician, who said in front of everybody at the school, there were 200 of us, 250 of us, that French French was going to disappear in 15 years. Only math was worth anything. I heard that a lot of time, that our French language was going to disappear. That was 60 years they were saying that. And it's not disappeared. So that's why I'm optimistic. So I'd like to thank Ghislain.
Thank you very much, Madame Blanke. And j'aimerais vous inviter à les remercier pour leur présentation.
Okay. Madame, I guess we did all right.
Merci. Thank you. It is it's very encouraging to see this collaboration. We at the Canadian level of UNESCO, we are very interested in the cultures because we feel that dialogue is the heart of the social position, I had thought, when Frédéric spoke to me and invited me to speak here, I had no idea that I was going to be speak. It's only at the last minute, after several discussions with colleagues, they said, well, UNESCO must speak, has to say something, because encourage dialogue. So consequently, I said, well, I will check with the organizers to see what I should say. At the last minute, I wondered whether I was going to speak about the dialogue, and then I saw that in the program, you talk about music, you talk about storytelling. Then I looked at the place that anything I might say would have. It was evident that we are trying to launch a dialogue by using what? All the methods, the arts, the culture, the stories, as we saw yesterday, as we will see tonight, and the speakers of this morning. So, I'm very honored to be able to speak to this third roundtable, but it's an honor for the Commission and for my colleagues in Paris told me to congratulate the Institute, because the models that were developed, the models of dialoguing between the communities, whether it's within a nation or among countries, are really important. But I will use certain themes that have been brought out in this dialogue. It is also, it's equally a pleasure to find that it's being held in a city that is called North Battleford, that sees itself not only a mix of cultures, but of the native peoples and the Métis and French. This model that we are looking at over the next 3 days is a theme for the future, not only for those who are around the table, but particularly for the future generations. In this third roundtable, we will have the possibility of appreciating the hospitality of the people of the city, the richness of the evidence of the dance that is which will be more present again tonight, but also the storytellers who are very important in it. What we had, the tastes of the ethnos. This is all part of the development of the history. Those who are carrying this heritage and this richness should be able to inspire other dialogues, other exchanges, and not only inspire us, but inspire the method of approaching new dialogues. I particularly want to talk about the theme of the importance of dialogue and the diversity of cultures, and the importance of the dialogue itself in the community that might have been an element that has been there are always times that we will meet with the realization that without forgetting the past, that we have to concentrate on the present, but particularly the future. And whether you are newly arrived, I've been here for 27 years, but whether you're newly arrived or not, we discover a reality very quickly that the cultural diversity in this country is based on what? On three factors. The first being the presence of the native peoples, and that the second is, of course, is the expressions of the Anglophones who were here, and the Francophones. But how about the next factor is the new arrivals of new immigrants who have brought their cultures with them. And the society is becoming more and more diversified with models that have been experimented with in the country. And this creates the pride of the country. Those who come from out of this country, they realize that they are part of multiculturalism indeed. It probably isn't the subject of the day, but it certainly is a reality, and it's part of the reality of the country. Ladies and gentlemen, participants, it's not important. I don't need to say the following, especially after the clips we had yesterday, and what we have heard yesterday and today concerning the dialogue. As for UNESCO and its the organizations of with culture and dialogue, there are two themes that are right in the heart of UNESCO. It's the only organization in the United Nations that are interested in culture. You will see quite often, and I'll bring it up at the end possibly, but culture on an international level has taken a dimension that is very important. Before, we thought that culture allowed commerce as is. It had nothing to do with, wasn't like the economy, it wasn't something solid, it wasn't something hard. And that's true. But it is not something to be ignored. It's the identity of a nation. It's an identity of a community. Communities that are being represented here, whether they're Métis or Francophone, they have a cultural identity that is particular to them, that they have to share with other communities and show, but also to appreciate other cultures that surround us, because it creates a greater, it enriches each culture. Each culture enriches the other. And the year 2010, to identify the importance of dialogue, the intercultural dialogue, 2010 has been declared as the cultural year, and around all countries as the international year of bringing cultures together, encouraging cultures and other countries to not only appreciate what someone else has to show them or teach them, but to not hesitate to partake of it. In the intention of UNESCO and in the creation of UNESCO, the material heritage of cultural heritage is knowledge, history, the instruments, the music, the objects, the artifacts, the various aspects of the culture that is associated with any given culture, carry with them that message, and that is the essence of pride. And a cultural heritage is being transmitted from generation to another and has to be assured but also needs to be certain that it relates to the contribution of identity of the individuals, of the artists, of those who express that aspect of culture. Cultural heritage manifests itself in various ways. We heard expressions today. We talk about legends. We talk about the language itself, the music, the songs, the theater. Habitual practices, social practices that are undertaken, that are rituals and festive elements that are very, very important, that identify the individual, that give you not only your pride but your identity. There's the nature, for instance, was involved. The hunting, fishing is very important for the First Peoples. The relation they have with the forests and nature is terribly important, and it manifests itself in their culture. The expressions are defined by the communities themselves. They are the ones who carry it and transmit it from generation to generation. And I ask that, as the lady spoke this morning, that the message of her memories and her heritage, but these memories, these things have to be transmitted, and they have to be put in place by the storytellers. The young have to understand and have to receive these messages. The place of this heritage in the level of at the level of society, the regular society, there's a specificity that comes with it. The heritage contributes to intercultural dialogue and the practices of the cultural practices of artistically and that we have seen and will see yet. But we have to be able to accept it, appreciate it, and it helps us to exchange expressions and cultural norms and habits. This is the third round of roundtables, and I hope it will continue, because regardless of the medium we use, what is important about this forum is that it continues to communicate. There's an expression it expresses the identity and the continuity going from generation to generation, and the expression of diversity, our cultural expressions as we express them, whether individually or at the community level, it's what we show to others. We haven't always used this method. We've occasionally said our method of expressing ourselves is not important. Yes, it is. The specificity of heritage and the material side, I would like to bring this up. There's a researcher who's well known who said that the fundamental factors of unity and the continuity of traditional culture, whether it be the Métis or other communities, is not interested in expanding or spreading their culture, but looking to allow the expression of the importance of the way it is expressed to others, and have it appreciated by others, and receiving the particular cultural expressions, to receive the thoughts, that should be recognized as being equal and just as important and having value in things of life and transmitting and carrying a richness of life. I won't bring up the expression that the lady brought up this morning. I hope that this launches us far, that might put together and in a joint manner what the two communities wish to express, in which to show that there be projects in common and projects and expressions in common with the two cultures.
I'd like now to introduce our next speaker. As at every round table, we have speakers on scientific disciplines, researchers from the university world who speak to us for half an hour on their thoughts, on their research, on the subjects which are pertinent to the Métis and Francophone communities. Today, speaking about the Métis community today, we have Paul Chartrand.
Paul is born in Saint-Laurent, Manitoba. He's a doctor in law. He has been teaching at the University of Saskatchewan for many years. He has been a member of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. He was, for the last years, director of the Aboriginal Governance Program at University of Winnipeg. Paul Chartrand is a well-known legal advisor on Aboriginal issues in Canada and Métis issues, but also internationally. We're really pleased to have Paul with us again this year. He was with us in Batoche in 2007. And he will give a talk today that is linked with the book that's going to be launched tomorrow. And his talk is on Michif language and nationalism. Paul Chartrand. Use that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Fred. I'm not sure if I should sit down or stand up. I do have some notes because I don't want to go on and wander all over the place. So I'll see how I do. I begin by thanking Fred for their kind introduction, and I thank the University of Regina, and I thank all the organizers of these round tables for their laudable organization of this event. And I offer my greetings to the elders, all the participants here from the French-Canadian community and the Michif community and the other community that may be represented here today. I will be, as Fred said a little earlier, I'll be speaking in English. The reason for that is it is the language with which I have the most facilities. It's the language that I use every day and have been doing it for about 40 years. But I do understand French. Je comprends le français. Mais j'ai la misère à parler comme les Canadiens. So I think in English and just familiar with English. So, but I will be speaking a little bit more about Michif language in the moments that follow. And Fred, I don't know if you intended that there be some time left for interaction with the audience. Is that all right? Okay. And I saw in the program tonight there's something about a launch of the Falcon song. So I don't know if I'm speaking there or whatever, but all right. Thank you. Thanks for helping out. All right, so let me begin by introducing myself a little bit. Why am I talking to you? I'm not sure, but as he said, I'm from Saint-Laurent, Manitoba, and it's a place where we grew up speaking what we called Michif. It's our own language. But then I went to school, which was a mission. St. Laurent was a mission run by the Oblates since the 1830s. And then the Franciscan nuns set up a mission there around 1890 or so. So I was taught by missionary nuns, FMM, Franciscan Missionnaires de Marie. I don't think they're there anymore, but they taught us le bon français. So I was taught in French through elementary and secondary school, except for 1 year. I was doing well in school, so the Oblates wanted me to become an Oblate priest. So they got me to go to an Oblate residential school for a year. I did 2 years of Latin there, so I can still conjugate a few verbs and so on. But anyway, I didn't want to go back for another year. It was the year that Montreal Canadiens won the Stanley Cup. They beat the Toronto Maple Leafs. I remember that for you hockey fans out there, because first time that I saw television, was able to follow the Stanley Cup playoffs. That was pretty cool. It's the best thing I remember from that year, I think, because it was pretty well all or most of the people there were French Canadian boys. It was a defunct. It's now long gone, but it was a sort of classical studies place for Oblates, and the graduates would go to the Collège Saint-Boniface, but it was mostly French Canadian people. And let me, just to put it as charitably as I can, I wasn't very well treated by them and regarded as an outsider, so I didn't want to go back. And I remember that the local parish priest in Saint-Laurent got the permittee from Saint-Ambroise, which is another Michif community, the south end of Lake Manitoba, and they tried to talk me into going to Fort Alex Indian Residential School instead. And they offered me inducement saying I could be, I don't know, they gave me a job as a king of the kids sort of thing or something. I don't remember what it was, but I fought against it anyway, and my parents didn't make me go there. So I ended up not going to Fort Alex Indian Residential School, although funny how life comes around, though. I later on played old-timers hockey with some friends of mine who, it might include some people you might have heard of, Phil Fontaine and people like that, who were at residential school. So I told them my story. I almost bossed you around when you were a little kid. But anyway, professionally, what I've done is taught all the different grades in school, and I've taught law now for about 30 years in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. So I've been, by and large, an academic. And I've also done work at the United Nations, so I'm aware of the work of UNESCO, and I've written a paper for the World Intellectual Property Organization relating to Aboriginal self-government and so on. So what I'm saying is that although I profess no particular expertise in linguistics or much of the things I'm going to talk about, what I say will be based on my personal experience, and that's why I'm telling you a little bit of that experience. I have had the privilege of traveling across Canada, probably more than most Canadians ever get a chance to, mainly as a result of my work for 5 years as a member of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. I traveled everywhere in Canada, except for Newfoundland, Labrador, and Yukon. Never been to those places, but I've been pretty well everywhere else, and so gained a lot of experience talking to a lot of people, academic people, and through my UN work and competitive work in Australia and other places, I've had the opportunity to talk to Indigenous people from many countries. So that's the way that I've come to learn about these things. About language, I've casually and informally worked with various linguists, plumbing their minds about language and some aspects of language and so on. In fact, in 1985, I organized what I call a Michif language conference in Winnipeg, and there's a report that I had drafted. So far as I'm aware, it's the first ever Michif language conference ever convened in Canada. I'd invite those who have an interest in that to have a look at that report. I remember also in probably the 83, 84, somewhere around there, possibly 85, 86. I'm getting senile now and I forget these things. I had an interview with Anastasia Skilnick, who was doing a report on Aboriginal languages in Canada for the Federal Treasury Board. And that report was published, and it's one of two official reports. One was the other one was done in Quebec on Indigenous languages, and all those reports have concluded there's only 3 languages of Indigenous people in Canada that have a chance of survival. It's Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuktitut. See, so when I spoke with Anastasia, I said Michif, and I talked about Michif language. She'd never heard of it, and in fact, I can say that I had never heard the word spoken in public in universities or other public fora before, although I grew up with it, and I'd never seen it in print. So things have come along quite a long ways since then. There's a lot of interest in the languages, and I'll be commenting about that. Let me have a peek at my notes here, because I'm already starting to wander all over the place. I want to make a few comments first, so I'm going to be relatively organized. I want to start by commenting on language first, and then I'll talk about Michif, Indigenous languages, and Michif language in particular, and then move on and talk a bit about nationalism. I hope I can be heard, because sometimes I know I'm moving away from the mic, so let me know if this doesn't work, and I'll do something else, but I can't stand on my head. All right, on language. One of the things that fascinates me as an amateur about languages is it's the free man's ideal thing. What do I mean by that? What fascinates me is that languages are not the product of a central agency, a bureaucracy. What fascinates me is that a language is actually the result of conscious individual choices that are made every day by free individuals who decide that in order to communicate with other people, they will act in a particular way. And by that, mostly verbal, but not only verbal. As you know, much of communications involves body language, and commenting a little bit on that later on. So languages are dynamic things. They're always changing. I, for example, am one of those who listens carefully to these newly minted phrases and words that are wrongly used by bureaucrats. I don't know who manufactures this stuff, but about 4 times a year, some word gets mangled, like commit to, purportedly. There's all kinds of words are just mangled, and journalists and other people start using them wrong, and then it gets picked up. So it's very interesting to watch these dynamic work of the of language. The functions of language. I say this because I think for those who are interested in Michif language, preservation of language, or French language, I think these considerations are significant. That's why I'm talking about these things. So for language, I like to think about the various functions of language. So what does language do? Well, language communicates ideas. It can be the means of communicating on a daily basis. It can be a means of communicating for specialized purposes, either in professional work or as the language of business. But we sometimes overlook language as the language of ideas and the language of ceremony. And I've noticed this, that those people working with Indigenous languages, Michif languages, don't seem to put emphasis on that. Because it seems to me that any rational project on Michif language preservation should begin by asking, what is this for? Why do we act like that? Why do we say these things? Why do we behave this way? And then you should develop a strategy that promotes those important human ends. So, for example, if you think that, as Skilnick's report and the other reports have concluded, these languages are all dead as functional languages every day, can they not live as a language of ideas? If they live as a language of ideas, then you say, well, how do people keep ideas alive? Well, it's usually the work of universities and maybe other institutions, but then you put a focus on it in universities. If it's a language of ceremony, then you work it into ceremonial aspects of life. I mean, the Latin language, which is a dead language for a very long time, is a classic example of the ceremonial use of language. By the way, I'm one of those people that absolutely bemoans the demise of the Latin Rite Mass. And everybody my age I've spoken to feels the same way, but I won't take a poll here today because that would be a different tangent. How to keep it alive? In my discussions with folks, I've talked to two kinds of people. Idealists who don't seem to put a lot of weight on the question, why do you think it is possible to achieve what you're aiming for? And then there are realists who say, what are my goals? What means are available to me to achieve those goals? And in light of the answers to those questions, what's the likelihood that I'll ever succeed? Some people spend half a lifetime doing things that never achieve anything. So to me, if you value yourself and your own time, I think you'd want to begin with a functional approach like that. Well, I do anyway. All right. Very quickly on Michif language and identity. So I want to move over now, commented broadly on language. I want to talk a little bit about Michif language. People say Michif, of course, for reasons having to do with the pronunciation and archaic aspect of the word. An alternative a word that I grew up with, Métis. You know, the reason for the ch is that in our language we don't make the t sound in the middle of words except for the beginning of words. So a t is always a ch. So no self-respecting Michif that I grew up with anyway would say petit. You're talking like a nun. You say chi. You see, and there's a number of consistencies like that as well that I won't bore you with. There are, and there's Cree speakers here. The word Métis sometimes evokes a bit of laughter amongst Cree speakers because it's very close to a word that is likely to generate laughter when used in public forums. So some of you know here are laughing and you know what I'm talking about. So, but I don't want to engage in risque conversation. So I'll just leave it there as an in-joke for those who know what I'm talking about. The word has, like myself, I had no choice. I always grew up not only identifying myself, but being identified as Michif. What I find interesting nowadays is people are taking on that identity as a matter of choice. It baffles me. I'm aware that in Labrador, people call themselves Métis, and they say it in English, and which never heard growing up. And then also in Quebec, there's a group that recently had these debates, and they were debating, should we identify as Indians or should we identify as Michif? I find that baffling. It's just not part of my experience, and it's something unique that we can talk about some other day. There are reasons for that. I'm going to skip over them because I don't want to go off and talk about too many different things here. It's easy to get carried away, and I do want to make sure there's a bit of time for questions and discussion. Well, I remember the first time that I heard outsiders speak about Michif language is when I came back from a fairly long stint in Australia. And it was Dr. John Crawford, who was a linguist at the University of North Dakota. I was very interested in the Michif language spoken by people, particularly in Belcourt, North Dakota. There's an Indian reservation there, but half of the people there are Michif people. I know that not from reading books, but by talking to them and visiting with them. And so Crawford published a dictionary with Ida Rosalord and Patlin Laverdure. It's called the Michif Dictionary. So that's the first time that I encountered academic discussion about that. And then there were John Nichols from the University of Manitoba paid a little bit of attention to it. The University of Manitoba and University of Brandon linguists also dabbled in it. I remember one time at U of M going to a little forum that linguists had on Michif language, and here's this graduate student. He had some research project, and he was wondering about certain things about the language and so on. And to me, it was so obvious. He grew up with this stuff, so I think that I know it inside out. And they were asking questions that I thought were ridiculous because the answer was so evident. But the experience wasn't all that fun in a way because I quickly discovered that they weren't interested at all, in my view. You know, I think what their interest is a different interest. Their interest is to follow certain kinds of procedure in order to reach certain kinds of conclusions, and they didn't have any interest in talking to someone like me who can give them the answer in no time flat, you know. So anyway, so I just recounting some of the interesting experiences I've had since, you know, the modern era where people are paying formal attention to these things. There's a European scholar that has done a fair bit of work since then. He did his PhD on it. His name is Peter Backer. A number of people here probably have met him. So ever since I met him, when he started doing his research, I started to pester him, and I pester everybody that whenever I get a chance to try to be a little bit clearer about what it is that they're studying. Because what they do is, see, our people have been marginalized politically, socially, economically, and so on, and people don't have a lot of public influence, and as a result, people lack self-confidence. And one of the results of that is that people will pay attention to official words, or they'll really believe what people from a university say, that sort of thing. They'll tend to believe people in what they, you know, who speak or from so-called high positions of authority. And I think that's really regrettable, because in a way, people forget the authenticity of their own knowledge and of our own understanding of things and our decisions about what matters and what does not matter. So that is one thing that I have seen, and I've published some of these views of mine. I said, people say I'm speaking Michif. To me, that's the end of the story. It doesn't matter what linguists say. Linguists are free. They're free people like everybody else, and they can develop their own techniques, their own culture, their own procedures. They can reach their own conclusions. They can distinguish between dialects and languages and so on, and fine, great, wonderful, go for it. But the difficulty that I'm alluding to is the difficulty that if they're not careful when they're speaking and writing, because some of us are actually reading books nowadays, you see. And I say that because I've read a number of books where you can guarantee that whoever wrote that book in 1930s and 1940s never expected that any Michif would ever read, you know, those sorts of books. But anyway, it's one of the negative aspects of the academic focus on languages, and it's ruffled all sorts of feathers. But it's getting better now. And things that have been written more recently, they're a bit more sensible, and the people, academics, are becoming aware of these sorts of things. And every chance I get, I tell Michif people, you're the one who knows what the heck you're speaking, and you're the one who put a label on it, and that's good enough. But our people have that great lack of self-confidence that comes from political powerlessness. It's the same thing. I put it in the same basket as the ridiculous, what I characterize as a ridiculous attempts to pardon Louis Riel. You know, why seek a pardon for Louis Riel? If Riel is a hero, the Michif hero, bang. That's the end of the story for me. Why is it that people feel necessary to go and ask those in Ottawa, who are the descendants of those who hanged him for political reasons, what they think of Riel? So automatically, if you ask Ottawa people to forgive Riel, you are saying what our moral authority means nothing. It is their moral authority in Canada that matters and decides what's right and what's wrong around here. So you're talking to someone here who has been against that. And you know, I have said in Winnipeg, it's a stain on Canada what they did. I say, let the stain remain. And the other thing that I have said is this, that in every bill, they've had a number of bills proposed, legislation to forgive Riel, to pardon Riel. In every one of them, not one of them has ever proposed anything of substance to deal with the cause for which Riel died, which is the Michif cause. Therefore, ask yourself, what is Riel without the Michif cause? The answer is clear, at least to me. It's a Quebec Federalist cause. And I could spend a lot of time detailing my experience with these sorts of things. You've seen the ridiculous things on CBC and in other places, Dominion Institute and other things, and I've talked to those people. So it's another illustration, which applies to Michif language as well, of the marginalization of our people and the lack of influence of our people. So I've used the expression forgive and forget. I said they want to forgive Riel and forget the Métis, the cause for which he died. I want to talk just a little bit about the Michif language that I grew up with, which is by and large what I think I call it anyway an archaic French. Linguists have told me that we have expressions that have never have gone out everywhere else. So as I intimated a little earlier, you know, the nuns would say you're speaking bad French. I would be prepared, I am prepared to accept that maybe the Michif that I grew up speaking, and that's all I'm talking about at the moment, is bad French, provided that in the same vein it is accepted that le bon français disseur is bad Michif, you see? So tit for tat. So I want to talk to you just very briefly about what I view as the features of this language that I grew up speaking. I just made this up this morning. As I said, I'm an amateur. But I do want to finish this little part by making what I think is a very practical suggestion for you, you know, for this group here today. I should say, first of all, we have different values. So I remember an historian asking me a question one time. I just really laughed because she was asking about, there was a chief, she said, and his name was Cualaire. And she says, what is that? You know, she was kind of wondering about why somebody would have a name like that. And then I hadn't thought about it because it's been decades, you know, since I was young and growing up. And when you grow up, you don't ask yourself anything. You know, you just accept this is the world. I think you're weird if you do. It's only university people that who come up and ask these silly questions, you know, why are things the way they are? So I started laughing because at home, where I grew up, people had all kinds of nicknames. And if I may say so with respect, the kinds of nicknames that would make nuns faint in the street, to use an expression that I heard somebody else use. So I'm not going to give you any examples here today because it's just not something that works here in public because it's a Canadian public. But I can guarantee that, you know, if I were at home, I could say these things. And when we grew up, nobody batted an eye about, you know, these sorts of things. But today is just so. Talk about cultural clash. So now, you know, when I reflect back on these sorts of things, then it starts making sense why I and the others kept very quiet. Like when you move to the city or you're with French Canadian people or something, you're not quite sure how to behave, and you never know when what it is you're saying or the way that you're behaving is really bad. And that goes for body language as well. And with that, I'll start my features of the Michif that I grew up speaking. There's certain body language that goes with it, but I'm not going to do anything here because you'd think I'm really phony, and it would be phony, and I'd feel very uncomfortable anyway. But I'll just do one that I know that it's not only Michif people that do that. I think it's Cree and Saulteaux people, which is lip pointing, you see? And there are lots of jokes about lip pointing. So that's just one part of it. But there are others that, you know, might frighten you or something. So I don't want to frighten anybody. So all I can say is that they're unique. There's unique body language involved. There's a number of languages mixed up. Just thinking about it today, and there are some English words, you know, but we mangle them in such a way that they're unrecognizable. In fact, there's a couple of words that I sort of thought about in recent years. I said, oh yeah, that must be based on that English word, you know. So they're really changed quite a bit. Lots of French words I mentioned, and old expressions, some of which I talked to some people in Ottawa not long ago, and they said that they knew some people around Trois-Rivières or somewhere that use that expression. Au 500 un job. Does anybody here know the expression? Au 500 un job. Oh, il est loin, il est au 500 un job. You know that? Yeah. So it's a rare expression. So one linguist, Robert Papin, who's from Saskatchewan, he characterized the speech that I grew up with as a living linguistic museum because of that. It's got a lot of these old expressions. And then there's some Cree and Saulteaux words that I know are Cree and Saulteaux borrowed words as well that we use. And some expressions as well. They're hard to translate, like ka, things like that. So some of you Cree or Saulteaux speakers might recognize that. And you know when you'd say it. These are very culture specific. You say certain things or make certain sounds in particular situations. And they have a particular meaning which is untranslatable. The other thing is that they're words of unknown origin. And I thought maybe one of the things that might happen today is that somebody might help me. Because there are these words, I have no idea where they come from. There's still a collection of words, and I don't know where they come from. So I'm going to just give you a couple of examples, and some of you might say, oh yeah, I know that word or whatever. So one I mentioned is la jang. Nobody knows anything about it. I remember the first time I went to Belcourt, North Dakota, and I was sitting with a couple of friends that would go on there to talk to the people at the college because they were teaching Michif language. And we met some local there in the bar the night, the previous night. And so two of us were men, and this other woman was there with us from the Manitoba Métis Federation, and he said, "Akila Jangaba," you see? Now you understand? Yeah. So he said, who is that woman with you? But Lajang has quite a number of connotations. It can mean different things. It can be pretty positive. It can be negative. It can be insulting, depending on the context in which you use it. But that was the first time that I'd ever heard anybody use that particular word outside of my own community. So I put that in a category of unknown words of unknown origin. And there's even a song. That's a lost song, a song of unknown origin that everybody at home knows, and they're all words of unknown origin. I'd have to put my sense of dignity aside to try to do it because I can't sing, but maniwi, maniwa, kashiwi, kashiwa. Does anybody know that? That's the way it starts. I could go on and on and on, but there's a nonsense words. Have you ever heard that song? Yeah? Do you know where these words come from? There's no meanings to them. And I know that they're meaningless words in a way. Like I've never found anybody who knows what they mean. It's not French, Soro, Cree. I've spoken to people like that, and nobody knows. And I know that people know about it beyond Saint Laurent because someone that I met had a nickname that comes from one of those words, Chumilo. And I said, Chumilo, where did you get your nickname? What does it mean? I don't know, he said. I don't know what it means. Oh, he's right, because nobody knows. And then I said, well, who named you that? The elders, he said. You see, so our language is full of mysteries, So what I want to suggest is that if you wanted a really fascinating joint project between the Michif speakers, Michif community on the one hand, and the French-Canadian community on the other hand, what I would propose is this. You get together, Cree speakers, Soro speakers, Michif speakers, and Old Joël speakers, and French linguists, and study the language and sort out and answer some of these things. See, they're puzzles. These are historic times. We've been people who've been subjugated and marginalized. They're always kind of shy to, with other people, and you just don't want to mix with other people because you don't belong, even though it's our own country. That's I'm saying the way I grew up. So I think it would be nice if people are sincere about, recognizing the value of other people and the ways of life of other people to undertake projects like that. I'd be very happy to participate in a project of that kind. On nationalism, and this evening, maybe they'll give me a chance to talk for 3 minutes this evening on the book that I wrote on the Michif national anthem. So I won't say much about that, right now. Nationalism, of course, is a many splendid thing. It can mean all sorts of things. It can generate all sorts of feelings, all kinds of strategies, and all kinds of actions. And those of you who study these things formally are probably well aware of some of the ideas of someone called Ernest Renan, who wrote, I think in the 19th century, where's our resident linguist here, who talked about, the nation, nationalism as a crystallization of an idealized antiquity. And I think that captures the idea of national feeling very well. And I've seen the effect of not appreciating that in universities. I've seen where historians sort of get all exercised about the accuracy of records, of remembering of people. But I think they're silly because they forget that where the past is brought to work in aid of community making, then who cares if the thing really happened or not? And you may or may not be surprised to know that the mythic histories of all nations are probably full of blank blank. So people make up stuff, because they demonstrate the values of people, like George Washington and the cherry tree, for example. It simply says Americans believe in honesty, don't tell a lie. So I'm sure all peoples and all nations have these sorts of mythic history. Solon the Greek, the mythic founder of law, he probably never existed, so who cares? So I think that's one of the things that's relevant for people who talk about Michif language and French minority languages and history. And one of the things that's working against this true path to intellectual freedom, I would say, is the courts. The courts and the lawyers. If you wanted to, I could talk about that for a very long time, and you'll be happy to know that I will not. But I think the involvement of the courts and the lawyers on matters that touch upon these things has not been very good as a start for all sorts of reasons I won't bore you with. That's about it. I think these are pretty well the beginning comments that I wanted to make, and it's been certainly a pleasure to talk to people who might have a little bit of an interest in these things that, as I said, interest me pretty well as an amateur, but someone who's had the privilege of speaking to a lot of people and and about matters that seem to touch upon these very interesting issues, just like the thing that you're talking about, the Michif community and the French Canadian community. And as I said, I've had a chance to live in both communities. I live in the French Canadian community, I would say, when I went to that residential school. Plus I've also lived in Australia for almost a decade. I've lived in English Canada for a long time. I lived in the Michif community for a couple of decades. You see, so I've had the privilege of living in at least 4 very distinct cultures. So as a matter of experience, I know the differences between different linguistic communities and different cultural communities. The last word I'll say is the gentleman who spoke before me referred to culture. That is another very, very difficult thing that could open up another very interesting debate on the meaning of culture, but we'll leave that for another day. So with your permission, Fred, then if there's a couple minutes or as long as you call, because this is the boss right there, folks. Frederick Dupree, University of Regina, he's the boss. So if that's okay with you, we'll have some chit-chat here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merci, Chimigwech. Get it down here.
Question, Paul. Where do you see the Michif language coming from in an official category when you consider that the federal government started off on a policy of annihilation of its Aboriginal peoples? And if you look at the way that they treat Aboriginal peoples even today, it appears as if the same policy is still in effect, although somewhat degraded, but it's a policy of inactivity. Rather than resolving the problems, they go into the courts and then they stay forever and ever and ever. And it seems to me that perhaps if Michif is going to survive as a language, it has to survive from the groundswell, from the bottom people. I wanted to get your viewpoint on that.
Thank you very much for that very interesting, thought-provoking comment. I certainly agree respectfully with your remark about the policy of governments, not only in Canada, but everywhere in the former British Empire, to annihilate the Indigenous peoples as distinct peoples. It's very, very well known. No rational person will dispute that. In New Zealand, for example, what were thought of as benign policies for Indigenous people were characterized as this. These are things we do to smooth the pillow of a dying race. That was the attitude in Australia and New Zealand, in the United States and in Canada. This is very well documented. Now, some things have been killed by action. For example, the values of the people. Polygamy, for example, was killed by amendments to the criminal code. Kainai people, for example, were sentenced to prison, hard labor, because in Canadian values, you can have many wives, but only one at a time. Whereas with the Kainai, you could have several at the same time. You see, so they made that into a crime. I'm just giving you one example. There are many other examples. Religious freedom was killed, and so on, so on, so on. So I certainly agree with that. And other ways of killing things were by neglect, as you suggest. So I agree with all of that. Now, what's the government's role? Here's what I think in answer to your question. The government now is spending way more money on retention of French language. It has this French language policy, which is certainly a contentious issue, or ought to be a contentious issue for reasons we can discuss some other day. But it's also spending small amounts of money relatively on Aboriginal languages, and is not doing the right thing, in my view, in recognizing the official status of the indigenous languages. What I said, and actually I published a chapter in a book on this very point, saying that a just vision of Canada is one that is built upon what I call a North American foundation. A North American foundation means indigenous, people from North America. I say a true vision of Canada, a just vision of Canada, ought not to be, pardon the pun, a pale imitation of Europe, but it ought to be indigenous, And so if one believed that, then the government ought to do certain things about recognizing the official status of Michif language and other indigenous languages. I do not think it is right what the government is doing now. What it's doing is getting political favor by providing money to political representative organizations to save languages. My view, the effective way to do it would be to use institutions that do that. So what institutions retain language and develop rational strategies for language retention? And start with analyses like, what's the language for anyway? And then you divide a strategic research or whatever approach. Universities. So what I would recommend to anybody, or anybody asked me, and you did, is that funding be provided to universities to do that. Now, you can't just give it to outsiders, people who are not Michif speakers. That wouldn't work anyway, because they don't know anything, like in a sense. They're ignorant. So what you would need is you need advisory boards. But those advisory boards should be professional people. They should be independent people. And in my view, you should have people on that board who know the substance of things. And then what they should have too is appointees of Michif community and appointees of the government. Because, and I could give you lots of examples across the country. So long as the government is providing the money, the government ought to have a say in who sits on those boards. So I think that's a balanced view. So in very brief, short order, that's the way that I view it. And I'm not a politician. I wouldn't be saying these things if I were a politician, obviously. But
thank you. Yeah. Is there another question? Yeah. Question.
Paul, what do we lose when we lose a language? I'm giving you an example. In Quebec, the Abenaki people, in Saint-François-du-Lac, there are 4 or 5 people who still can speak Abenaki. So it means that few years, it would completely disappear. Nobody's talking about that. It has been there for thousands of years. What do we lose when it's gone?
You lose an understanding of the universe. You know, that's what you lose. And what humanity loses is on the function of UNESCO. What humanity loses is insights into understanding ourselves and the environment, the universe in which we live. We do not know the future. I would not want to know the future. But you never know when a unique insight is going to come in handy. So people today spend a lot of money sometimes, and properly so, I would think, in saving rare kinds of parrots and frogs and crickets and so on, which is good. I support that. But I think we should also spend money in saving the ways of a people. Because there are certain things, and those of you who speak several languages here, I think you'll agree with me. If you don't, please say so. There are ways of seeing the world, ways of understanding the way you ought to relate to other individuals that are unique to particular and expressed through language in a certain way. And you cannot translate that. You know, it's very difficult to translate that. So the short answer, you lose something precious to all humanity, is a way of understanding ourselves and our universe. I think another question. Yeah.
Mr. Chartrand, I come from a northern community called Green Lake. That's where I was born and raised. My first language was, incidentally, the Cree language. And there's a lot of French mixed with it too as well. But I wasn't aware of this Che dialect. I consider it a Che dialect in the Métis language because we use Che. Atoski means work, and Michif Atoski. Now, where did they pick up that dialect? What cultural group influenced that dialect? Because when I was working down south, in area in the southeast part, Moosomin, Welwyn, Rocanville, places like that, there was a lot of French mixed with their Cree, more so than our Métis language in northern Saskatchewan. Now, why is that? Where did that chick come from?
My answer is the one I indicated in a general way earlier. Is I don't know. You see, I said, I don't know these things. All I'm talking about is what I know, what I experience and the way I see it, the way I view it. I'm not saying I'm right or, I don't know the answer to that question, which is one reason why I suggested it might be really good, to answer. And you're showing that there is interest in the community in this, getting the French linguist people, the Joual speakers, the Michif speakers, Cree speakers, so get them all together and ask those questions, and someone will know, and then I think we will all together discover the answers to these fascinating questions there. Yeah.
There's another one here.
I think I might have a little bit of an answer. In French, we often, in our colloquial French, we often condense words. We will reverse words too. We'll have a regarde instead of regarde, or we'll end. Regarde, that's very, very common, the RE reverse, and it's just Old French. But also, I had a sister-in-law who was learning English, and she couldn't understand this word, and this word was always tst, tst. What was that? And she didn't, she was taking French at Athabasca University through correspondence. They never covered the tst part. And really, when people would say, ben, il y a une petite affaire, aujourd'hui, là, il y a des petites choses, des tst, tst, and that's petit. And tst is very, very, very common in French, and French speakers, I'm sure, will all agree with me that our language is just full of this tst. And the way that people spoke 200 years ago, it might have been much more strong. And sometimes you hear people who come from rural areas who've never been schooled, and they have retained a lot of these accents. And sometimes, we have to strain to understand because they are still carrying a very old patois, an old dialect that's part of the language. I really think that it's very, c'est français, dire la petite affaire, it's there.
Chumigresh, thank you for that. And I think that, my assumption, and I think others have mentioned it here, is that there's always good cross-fertilization, it's probably not the right word, between different cultures. That was a wrong image. I'll tell you what my favorite is. It was by Arlo Guthrie's dad, Woody Guthrie. For those of you who don't know, is a famous American folk singer and songwriter. And apparently, I heard this on a 78 RPM record. Apparently, one time, Woody was talking, and he was commenting on the fact that a lot of songwriters were really upset because people were stealing their lines. And so Woody says, I don't care. He says, people steal from me, and I steal from everybody. And here comes a classic line on the question of intercultural exchange, and he says, plagiarism is basic to all culture.
We have another question here, Paul.
Yes, it's just by curiosity that I'm asking this question. It's very personal. has nothing to do with the purpose of the whole workshop here. But in terms of
you'll have to ask Fred.
yeah, well, in terms of languages and the whole concept of a communication and cultural backgrounds and the words that we do use, sometimes we take things for granted. And right now I'm hiring, for example, a contractor who is doing some renovations in my basement. So among some of the things I asked him to do was to cut a new window in my basement. I asked him to give me a new window. For me, it was very clear, and he understood it. Then a few days later, he said, you know what, I'm going to give you a solid pane window. Then I walked away. I said, fantastic, that's exactly what I want, because I understood that he's going to give me a solid window that will be able to resist any kinds of weather. So I was happy with that. I walked away. Then a few days after that, when he was installing the window, I came down and said, well, so what is this? He said, this is the solid pane window I promised to give you. And look, you won't be able to open it because it's solid. So I said, what? I won't be able to open my window? So what kind of window is that? You see, I just asked for a window, and look, who's saying, you know, you don't even know what you want. I said, come on, you're becoming disrespectful. You are saying that I don't know what I'm asking for. I asked you for a window. You know? So he said, well, for me, a window is a window. You know, my cultural background, you know, there is no specification for a window, right? But he said, you know, you have to tell me why you need that window. Is it for light? You see? Is it for air? That way, if it's for air, then I would have given you something that will be able to open and close, right? So I said, what? I don't get you. I just want a window. And Mr. Bizimana would agree with me that in our culture, idirisha, the window, we call it idirisha, it's just a window with all the functions that a window can do, right? But then this comes down to the difference between some languages that are, and here's where my question lies, the low content languages, like the English and the European languages, very low content. Like that guy took it in a very low content model versus then the high content. Like the African languages are all high content. A window is a window, a rain is a rain. Lots of pictures, lots of images, very proverbial. So the Cree language and the First Nation languages, including the Michif, in which category can we, are they low content or high content?
Is which low content or high content, sorry?
That's my question. The Michif, is it classified, or can we classify it as a low content, or the rich one, the high content?
Okay, I don't know, because you see, your question. You notice his question. He says, "How do you classify it?" You see, that's the kind of. Classification is the craft of the linguist. You see, it's a dialect or it's a language. I asked, a lot of people say, well, that's just a dialect. That's a dialect of French or a dialect of Cree and so on, you know. So one time I was in Europe for a number of conferences, and I noticed that everywhere I went in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Germany, and other places, I had no problem figuring out which is the exit and which is the entrance. And I had no problem figuring out which was the women's washroom, which one was the men's washroom. They're all related. You can tell. This is all Germanic languages, you know. So, by the way, it's different in the South Pacific. I had Wahina, I know is the women now in Hawaii and all the Polynesian languages. So you guys don't go into Wahina, washroom. But anyway, so I asked this academic, I said, what's the difference between a dialect and a language? And he said, a language is a dialect with an army. You see, so if you have the political power to assert your uniqueness as a language, so it will be. And it's dead true for the Michif language. You say it's a language. Linguists say it's a dialect, blah, blah, blah. And that's why I encourage people, you decide, you say, this is my language. It's your language. That's the end of it. We just don't have a big enough army. But I only know one window story. I'm avoiding your question because I don't know the answer. But a good Cree friend of mine, Albert Angus, was telling these jokes one time, and I told them to a non-Indigenous audience after. This was the Indigenous Bar Association. We all killed ourselves laughing. And I tried to tell the same jokes to a non-Indigenous audience 4 days later. Nobody laughed. I don't know what to do. You just melt, and nobody laughs. But anyway, so he's talking about poor jokes. One of them was, kind of like I grew up. I was one of 12 children of a fur trapper, fisherman, carpenter. So he said, when I was young, he said, there were so many of us, he said, we all slept sideways in the same bed. He said, if you had to get up middle of the night to go to the bathroom, you had to put a bookmark there to keep your place, he said, But then the window one is, he says, we're so poor, my father wasn't able to buy me any clothes when I was little until I was 5 years old. Then he bought me a cap so I could look out the window.
Thank you. Maybe a last question? Yeah, Bruce. And we'll go on.
It's not really a question, it's a comment. I think the word you were, am I going to say this right? Che? Would you said that word, che?
Ka.
Oh, I thought you said che.
I don't know. I forget.
Peter, Bishop, I think he said che. Is that what you said, che?
Yeah, but we don't use that.
Yeah, okay. When I was growing up, we used that word. It meant little, che.
Oh, chi, yeah.
Chi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chi. Chi, yeah.
I guess maybe I'd make a comment to Peter, I guess.
Yeah.
Because you knew what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what it is, but
Chi, yeah.
Peter doesn't.
Yeah.
Chi is, for example, if someone was named, say Louis Olette, and his boy was named Louis, so we'd call him Chilouis.
That's right, yeah. That one I understand.
And the other one we grew up with children, Leap Chi.
Yeah.
Leap Chi.
Yeah.
So that Chi was in there, Peter.
Yeah.
Chi.
Yeah.
It's not a made-up word. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, yeah. I just wanted to comment on it.
I see, yeah, now I recognize what you're saying. I'm hard of hearing among other things. When I was little, I used to go hunting all the time with shotgun, and the audiologist said, were you in the army? I said, no, but I'm pretty deaf, and I couldn't hear at the beginning, so now I understand what you're saying. Thanks for the question, if that's what you were saying. Same thing, we use the same thing. And one of the complications of language, though, is because different people use it, and then Soto and Cree is Gichi, at least Soto anyway, Gichi, which means big. It's the opposite. But there's irony in it. Sometimes someone was small, so you'd call them big, eh? So, but you never know if someone was called Chi because he's big or he's small, or if you're making fun of it. But I'll tell you one that's common, and you Michif people here will probably agree. My late friend Harry Daniels one time said to me, he said, Paul, he said, if you want to give half a dozen guys a whiplash, he said, just go into an Indian or Michif community in the West and yell, hey, chaboy!
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Great.
Fransaskois, Wilfred Denis He was born in Saint-Denis in Saskatchewan. He's professor of sociology at the University of Saskatchewan. He's been there for a long time. He was a committed citizen for a number of years for the Fransaskois community. He was an elected member for the Community Assembly, and he was president. Today he's going to give us a talk on inclusive citizenship for Métis and Francophone peoples. I should also say that Mr. Denis was president of the Inclusion Commission for the Fransaskois, which dealt with the question of the cultural relationships within the Francophone community. So let's welcome Mr. Wilfred Denis. Thanks very much, Frederick. I'd like to ask Michif ancestors and our Francophone ancestors, and I hope that my presentation will contribute to the bringing together of the two communities to create a better world for our children and grandchildren.
I feel somewhat humbled to address you this morning. You wonder sometimes at university you're an expert of what, and you're not too sure what the answer should be. But after all the excellent presentations and testimonials yesterday, you're going to find some of your ideas surfacing this morning. And I thank you for that, but it's a bit humbling to stand here this morning and address you with some of your own ideas.
So, towards an inclusive citizenship for Métis and the Francophone people, when we tried to translate the title in English, we had difficult because métis as an adjective doesn't exist in English. So I'm going to deal with 5 themes. I'll speak about some definitions, the work of the Committee on Inclusion, and the notion of citizenship. I'll deal with the book by John Ralston Saul, published in 2008, and go back to the idea of citizenship at the university. And I have a technical problem. I prepared a PowerPoint, but I have too much information on the PowerPoint, so I have to jump over a few of them. You won't always have the time to read everything there. That doesn't really matter. It's a question of integrating the material. You'll see what that leads to. So when you talk about it'd be useful to remind yourselves of some basic definitions. When you look at the word Métis in French, the word Métis, it's a crossing of different races, and when we try to translate that in English, we have words like mixed blood, cross-fertilization, which Paul mentioned yesterday. When we put a capital M on Métis, we deal with a proper name, and usually we refer to people coming out of the encounter between Indians and European colonizers. But there's also political problems. Who has the right to call themselves Métis? Only those in the Western Canada? As we saw yesterday, the south of Quebec and Labrador, do they have the right to use this name? So when we put the word Métis with country, we are a country of mixture of two civilizations. So I'm going to come back to some of these ideas, dealing with a book by John Ralston Saul, and I want to begin by talking about diversity. And in Canada, for the last 30 years, when we talk about diversity, we automatically go to multiculturalism. And you know, as we know, some of us remember that 1971, the federal government adopted a policy on multiculturalism. And 1982, with the adoption of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there was one section which dealt with multiculturalism, which recognized the place of multiculturalism as an essential part of Canada's founding. And in 1988, we had the multiculturalism law, which led to all kinds of programs to support and extend multiculturalism in Canada. Some researchers, that's the job for the university people to try and simplify complicated ideas, dealing from the word multiculturalism, which tries to deal with understand what that means. And I use some Fleuras examples, which other people have written on the subject. When you talk about multiculturalism, you have to distinguish the facts. What exists really exists, and we have to recognize that in Canada we have at least 223 ethnic groups, according to the census of 2006. But the multiculturalism also deals with the ideas that we have about it, about diversity. And there are some who positive views on that, and others who have very negative views on diversity. So there's a whole question of a discussion. There's also the policy, the politics. How do we change ideas and diversity into concrete policies? The federal government and 6 provincial governments have multiculturalism policies in Canada. Why not the other 4 provinces? Well, we have to see that. When we establish policies, we have to put them in, implement them. So we have programs. So there are federal programs and the programs in the 6 provinces to support the Canadian diversity. And there's also the criticism of these policies and programs. I often recognize that all this is varied from one period to another. As society evolves, there are pressures on one side or another. That changes according to the context. I'm not going to dwell too much on the work by Fleuras, but I'd like to show you that he identifies 7 dimensions of multiculturalism to see how that changes through the different historical periods. And that gives us a table like this. I'm not going to go through all the columns, but there's a certain evolution over time. In 1971, when we first adopted the policy on multiculturalism, we did what Fleuras calls ethnicity, celebrate difference in diversity between the ethnic groups. And that was the second column was, but then people said not all the groups are big. There's questions of equality, social equality. So we passed in the 1980s towards the multiculturalism of equity multiculturalism. And there again, we realized that there were problems. So we moved again or evolved in the 90s to civic multiculturalism. And there are the different sectors. I could dwell on that, but all I want to show you is that we have developed this idea of multiculturalism. It's complex, and it's evolving over the years. The 2 things which lack are missing on the Fleuras table, and other tables too. The first thing which is missing is the historical context. There's a historical context which is much broader for multiculturalism than only starting in 1971. And we have to include the multiculturalism in that historical context. And when we look at the facts, the ideology, I'm going a little too fast here. The second thing which is lacking, which is missing, what is the reaction of the minority communities towards these policies and programs? The policies come from the government from the top to the bottom. But the bottom, the basis, are not passes. They react. And one of the reasons why we change multiculturalism from ethnic to equity and civic is on responding to the reactions, the reaction of the governments to the pressures by the communities which are affected by these policies. So there's a whole dimension, dynamic dimension between government policy and communities, which goes beyond the tables by Fleury. So when we go on to the historical context, from 1963, the dominating context of what Canada was, as we can be conforming to Anglophone standards, the pressure through the institutions to bring all the Canadians to recognize the domination of the English language, not only the language, but the culture and the institutions right across Canada. After the reaction of Quebec and the French Canadians to who, after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham and the Canadians too, we were forced to recognize a certain never of bilingualism that was made official in 1967 in the British North America, 1867, the British North America Act, and 1969 with the Official Languages Act. And so the conformity to Anglophone standards became bilingualism, and then multiculturalism from the 1970s. And then, so I talked about multiculturalism, ethnic multiculturalism, civic multiculturalism in 1990. After the 90s, we had a lot more immigration, which came from Africa and Asia, and we realized that we had problems with racism. Subtle racism, or sometimes less subtle. And so there were programs to develop an anti-racist multiculturalism. We're still living with that. The question I ask is, are we going to develop a hybrid model which will make it possible to integrate the different dimensions of all these forms, Anglo-conformity, bilingualism, towards multiculturalism? Is that going to be a model which is a transforming model? Can we develop a model which will help us to transform Canada, change Canada? For me, talking about the Commission of Inclusion, the idea of diversity has limits, as that has been shown. It's not limited to the question of multiculturalism. It's broader than that. In the Francophone community, and I'm going to have to introduce another word for those who don't know it particularly. It's the Fransaskois term, and that I could explain it why. But for those who don't know this term, the Francophones of Saskatchewan at a certain point had to get a name, rather like the Métis did. Were Michif, but the Francophones in Saskatchewan had to have a name, and they chose the name Fransaskois, Francophones of Saskatchewan. And the Francophone community in Saskatchewan had to recognize that we had problems with diversity. We had a high rate of mixed marriages with Anglophones, 80% among our young people. We had a lot of activities where there was an Anglophone presence. There's always the question, I have to know, in the community activities or social activities, how many Anglophones, how much English should we use, the greeting at the beginning, everything should be bilingual, French and English. How do we deal with the English language within those institutions and our communities? Thirdly, more and more we have immigrants who come from Francophone countries and from new sources we didn't have before. Already talked about that. All that happened at a central point, a key moment in 2005, when the young Francophones of Saskatchewan and the school boards Fransaskois school boards. And I don't going to elaborate on that, but the problem between the two organizations was brought to the Community Assembly, which was our overall provincial organization, and the provincial organization recognized that the problem was more complicated than just the conflict between Francophone games and the Francophone youth. So they established a commission on inclusion to look at the question just of inclusion. And there was a panel, there were public hearings, and a report. And the report, the title of the report was the Committee of Inclusion of the Fransaskois Community from Minority to Citizenship. I emphasize that part, the rest of my presentation. There are 24 recommendations. I'm going to give you 2 of them this morning, which are key to my presentation. The first recommendation was we wanted to see who can participate, who can take part in the Fransaskois community, who has the right to say he's Fransaskois or she's Fransaskoise. Francophone of Saskatchewan, the recommendation was that we recognize Fransaskois is the action of choosing to live at least a part of your life in French in Saskatchewan. So a Fransaskois is a people who identifies with Francophones world in Saskatchewan or in the Fransaskois community, contributes to the vitality of the French language, contributes to the development and growth of the development of Francophone communities in Saskatchewan. And there's no reference to the person being speaking French, having to speak French. It's possible to do all these things and to not speak French. Next, we rejected a basic definition of identity by race, origin, or genealogy. So the Commission did not maintain the most popular definition of Fransaskois by race in Quebec, Quebecer by race. No, Fransaskois are people who identify with the community and participate in the community. And the reason for that is that we have accepted a way of looking at the world which says that identities are not given at birth once and for all by genes, by our parents, but they're built socially by our interaction with others within our group, but also with other groups who are around us. The second recommendation, and we could talk about these, we could discuss these things more in detail, and you can enroll in one of my courses if you want. They only last 3 months. It's a little difficult to reduce that to half an hour. A second recommendation. The Commission recommends to the Francophone community in Saskatchewan, it is important to get rid of the image of the victim linked to the idea of an oppressed minority and to think in terms of citizenship. And so we had witnesses yesterday of Francophones and Métis, the oppression in our schools when the French language was forbidden. So we have a tendency to see ourselves as victims. We have to put that aside, and we recommend that the ICF give a value to the status of the French language and culture in society as a basic element in building Canadian identity. To be a Fransaskois is a privilege which allows you to contribute to Canadian civic life. It's an act of citizenship to be a Fransaskois. And what do we mean by this recommendation? So the recommendation of the Commission was to turn, not only to look at what we have to do within the Francophone community, but also to see what the Francophone community must do to influence, to change the society around it. So we have to give a value to the Francophone community and constructing the Canadian identity, building the Canadian identity. We have to take our place within this Canadian identity. So it's a very wide mandate, very broad mandate. What does it mean to be Fransaskois? It's an act of citizenship. So I'd like to go into more detail on that, on the idea of citizenship. And there again, there's a lot of publications on that. When we talk about, we say we're a Canadian citizen. We think about what does that mean. We think we have rights, especially we can belong to political parties. We can represent a political party. Most Canadians, however, to be a citizen, it means that we have the right to vote. And recently, the right to vote a little too often. And we're going to perhaps vote again soon. But to be a citizenship is not something which concerns us a great deal. We take it for granted that we have that, the citizenship, the right to vote. In the 1950s, T.H. Marshall in England, who asked some questions about citizenship, he, like Lafleur, he said we're going to open that up a bit more. He said to be a citizen means we have to recognize there are different types of rights. First of all, civic rights. And we find that in the Charter of Rights of 1982, the right of freedom, the freedom of speech, of thought, of ideas of religion, association, contracts, and they also recognize the list of property, but it's not included in the Charter of Rights of 1982. We also have political rights, political power, elections, running for office, a higher rate of freedom of association to form a political party. We have the right to run for election. We also have social rights, access to education, social services, and health. According to Marshall, these rights, Flera said, have evolved historically. So at the beginning, the civic rights began in the 1700s. The political rights began in the 1800s, and the social rights began in the 1900s. Especially in 1900 with from 1929, the Great Depression, we developed more and more social programs that we had called the État-providence, or the welfare state in English, health insurance, welfare, and peace. The people who suffer the most disadvantaged, can be helped by society. For Marshall, they're developing a citizenship, and especially the development of his different categories of rights, where the objective was to integrate all the social classes of England within society, include them all within society, British society, to avoiding fragmentation and revolution, as we said, where the popular classes rebelled, and there are other examples, and we demolished the existing system. So that was the integration of the working class and this least favored people. We have to recognize that these rights are not, the categories are not plateaued. They became because on a plate offered to us. They became because demands by the unions, by women, and universal suffrage. And that didn't extend to workers and women at first. We know how women had to struggle to get for decades to have the right to vote. We have to can't forget that in Canada, the last province to give the right vote to women was Quebec in 1942, because the natives, the First Nations, only got the right to vote in 1960, not that far back. We have to remember that these rights came thanks to the struggles and the pressures coming from different groups and their demands. There's a whole literature developed in Canada. Catholic, for example, we have to see how this idea of citizenship, liberal democratic citizenship, evolved in Canada.
Went a bit too far. I mentioned that these rights are included in the Charter, but we still have an important problem. If the democratic rights rest on the majority vote, how can you defend the rights of the minorities then? What place can we give them in a democratic society that depends for political power on the majority vote? Now that is where the Charter tries to respond and answer to this question, to the needs of the minorities. The Article 16 and 23 regarding the language rights, the English, the Métis and the French that are particularly mentioned in Article 25 and 35, and the natives, the Inuit and the Métis in Article 27. They're mentioned quite specifically, and they managed to reduce these or to define them a little more clearly, because to figure out what multiculturalism really is, even for the First Nations, we know they have historic rights, but what are historic rights? It's not clear, and the only way to do that, to clarify it, is to re-examine. John Saul tried to broaden the question on Mon Pays Métis, my Métis country, in arguing that these ideas of diversity have to be situated in a broader context than simply the fact that two civilizations met. We're not talking about two cultures here. We're talking about two civilizations. It was the meeting of the Amerindian civilizations and the European civilization, and we have to recognize this. And unfortunately, in Canada, we did not recognize this. The effects of the métissage, in other words, of the blending or the interaction of these two civilizations. Now, there are periods in history of Canada where there have been partnerships and coexistence between these two civilizations, particularly the French regime, and at the beginning of the British Empire establishment in Canada. But there were other periods that we tried to define the Amerindian civilization and tried to destroy it. At the time of the Family Compact, for instance, and the arrival of the arch-conservative Orangemen who came, the Loyalists in short, who came in 1812, or 1840 to 1850 in any event. So that's 100 years right there. John Saul tries to underline, when he speaks of the two civilizations, try to explain a different slant. The definition of the circle, for instance, it's a concept that is based on oral tradition. Concept that allows to increase the circle by broadening its circumference. It's a concept that recognizes that you nourish the center by the circumference. So a strong center is better served by a broader circumference. And in order to have an effective dialogue and to hear all voices, and we try to establish an equilibrium between the relationships. In any event, as we consider this as the diversity and the dialogue, we accept that dialogue can take time, and that we have to go into depth to really understand one another. So it's important to recognize the complexity of things, and that there have to be at times a doubling of power. In brackets here, John Saul is not the first to have written about this. There were other authors and philosophers and natives who recognized this. Saul recognizes that when an Anglophone, it seems to be that when an Anglophone dares to speak of something like this, a huge portion of the population pays attention. But when it's a minority that talks about it with equal sense, nobody pays attention. It's easier to ignore in any event. Ralston Saul, the European indicates that the European concept is very linear. It's just think about it. From right to left, from top to bottom, right to left, the straight lines on a page. It reduces everything to the simplest format. For instance, in contracts, you take the fundamental values. One of our objectives is looking at the development, find new and better, more and improved, the progress, the development, but also the domination. Be it domination of nature or domination of the ability to reach the goal. In the linear format, we find a way of resolving the problems by simplifying them, reduce them to the simplest dichotomy, and the European system seems to see either right or wrong, black and white, very simplified. We also try to double up. One of the big problems in our provinces are the powers of the federal and the provinces, and they overrun each other. But I'm going to skip a few things. There's the inclusion and the notion of consensus. So John Ralston Saul has an interesting argument on the development of Canada, and from 1840, an interesting policy to try to eliminate the native civilization, but since 1960 we began to reintegrate certain notions. Multiculturalism for Ralston Saul is a First Nation notion, and we don't find the source of the notion of diversity, of multiculturalism in any European country. There is no country in Europe that has recognized the diversity that we have in the multicultural policies that we have in Canada. So therefore, our greatest failure, according to him, is that we failed to recognize the contribution of the First Nations, of thinking, the thought the thought of the First Nations in the development and establishment of Canada, and we did not categorize it. So when we include this notion of citizenship in a more complex notion with the evolution that is more complex. We recognize that the Charter transforms the rights of the minority into judicial rights, but that is not the entire solution. Because the rights of official language minority rights, there's an indicator about that's very clear as to the ruling on our schools. And when that was finally recognized, and we had to go to the Superior Court of Canada to find out exactly what they meant by this particular right, and we're still not clear on it because we're still defending it in front of the tribunals. So when we come to Articles 25 and 35 on the rights of the First Nations, it's even more vague because we are trying yet to specify what the particular rights are for the First Nations. So we have to recognize that Canadian citizenship, I propose, I'm not laying down the law here, but we want to develop the idea of citizenship in order to recognize the more integral people of the First People and their contributions within the framework of the cultural aspects of a community. In order to do that, we have to recognize that social structures, the institutions, that we've given ourselves, the universities, the schools for majorities, our political parties, our media, all those economic structures, businesses, have a tendency to keep the Anglo-conformity that we recognize the integration of certain bilingualism. We make an effort in multiculturalism we have to do things to point out the anti-racist aspects, but in the big institutions, they have more flexibility with regards to those questions. We'd like to have this develop to an inclusive model. Diversité. I'm trying to beat Frédéric's sign to stop. Anyway, what kind of action can we take? What can we do other than the judicial approach to find some practical and real effective transformation in the smaller institutions? How to include the First Nations and the various cultural communities. I'm trying to get to the end of this. And finally, anyway, in the conclusion, we have to develop a conversion of interests. We have to recognize where we have common interests. They don't have to be identical. They have to be common. Where do we have common values? Fundamental values that are common among us, to humanity, essentially. And what is the common vision that we can develop of all those who do not share the power? And according to Saul, we have to recognize that Canada is a Métis country, and this is where the problem. It's not a Métis country. To bring it from French into English, the idea of convergence and Métis in this sense is not the same as the political or popular sense that we use it in English. So the report of inclusion of the Fransaskois community ended by choosing as a title in its second recommendation to say to be Fransaskois is an act of citizenship. That is to say, to live and survive, to refuse to disappear. It's a confirmation of what Canada and the Canadian citizenship should be. That is what we wanted to affirm in 2006. And today, to be Michif is an act of citizenship also. To be a First Nation, member of any one of the First Nations in Canada, is an act of citizenship. To recognize the full rights of immigrants, to receive them, not only because we need them, but because we want them in the Canadian family, is an act of citizenship. And we should normalize these notions with a broader definition of what citizenship means. We've got to deepen it, deepen the idea of democracy and of the rights, the equality, of equity. And it's evident that none of these groups can do it alone. We need alliances. We need to broaden the circle, broaden the circumference to strengthen the center. So, from a minority to citizenship, the hope of one cannot depend on the despair of the other. Now we'll have a short period of questions and answers for this.
Thank you very much. Claude.
Thank you very much. If I may offer some very brief comments on your presentation, which I found very, very instructive. First of all, thank you for making clear what I had guessed was the shift, a rhetorical shift from multiculturalism to diversity, because as someone who's not a sociologist, I've been completely baffled by the usage of the word diversity, which is empty of agreed content, for ordinary folks like me. Thanks for making that clear. The idea of citizenship is intriguing indeed. You've presented in a wonderful way one aspect of it. Let me comment on the very positive approach that you've referred to as a result of the work of this commission, where you propose that belonging ought to be encased in the idea of citizenship and duty. These ideas should be looked at with great care by the First Nations, who are now concerned about creating their own citizenship codes in reaction to certain litigation that's going on, as well as the Métis organizations who are interested in membership codes. There's much to be learned from some of these general principles that you have discussed for these people, and I find generally people, do not go to the fundamental questions, ask questions like I think you've introduced here. What sort of society do you want at the end? And so who ought to belong, and what ought to be the duties, what ought to be the relationship between the individual and the society in order to say, yes, you belong here. There are, of course, other conceptions of citizenship which may make the term, at least, if not the idea, a bit problematic if you try to insert it in the First Nation and Métis registration systems. I will just give an example. The ideals of citizenship from antiquity to modern times, as discussed by the New Zealand scholar John Pocock. You're probably familiar with his work. He works out of the United States now. That's another aspect of it. Similarly, the idea of rights, to which you could add the development of the 3 generations of human rights since 1948. And if you did that, then you would come at a different angle, a different perspective on the problem of self-government rights, the rights of the minorities, as you call them, generally the Aboriginal peoples. Where do those rights come from? You would know because of recent developments. They come through the lens of international universal human rights. The final comment that I want to make, and I'm making all these in a spirit of positive commentary, is that in reflecting on some of your suggestions, I was glad to say that you did not think that going to the courts was the entire answer or the happy answer, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. The Métis community has much experience in that, in hearing too much from the judges. If you go and ask the judges to decide something in Canada, you can pretty well conclude that they will agree that, oh yes, we have the authority to decide that. One of the messages I'm trying to get to everybody is, wait a minute, don't be careful of what you ask judges to decide, because they will want power, or they will want the power to decide. So that what the community has to do is to decide what it is the authoritative decision maker on. And that applies for the Fransaskois community as well as any other community. You have to say to yourselves, you know, do we know best what our interests are? Yeah. And if we know best what our interests are, then all we are seeking is some form of institutional protection for those interests, which you call rights, you see? Now, who should decide what is the nature of those rights? Be very, very careful what you go and ask the courts to decide for you. There are just very, very bad developments in the court for Métis people in that regard. I'll just give you a small example. Do you believe for one moment that the Quebecois people who have a lot of political power, do you believe that they would go to the courts to ask what their rights are? Come on, that's a joke, isn't it? Do you know the history of that the federal government over the Quebec question had to go and install a special lawyer to represent Quebec because Quebec wouldn't. So people who have power will themselves decide. We are the authoritative decision makers. So again, thank you for introducing what I am suggesting is an extremely important idea, is that what is the legitimate role of the courts as opposed to what's the legitimate role of the community itself. Again, Chimigwech, thank you very much, Claude Denis, for a very interesting speech.
I fully agree with you. And in opening the question of citizenship, what that means, the basis, the foundation of citizenship, that opens the question of what means democracy. Who has the right to decide for whom? And that's where we see that the idea of democracy that we inherited from our European heritage from the 19th century, the work's still not finished. The project is not completed. I can ask for one last question.
Bonjour.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Wilfrid, for this presentation.
One of the things that I would like you to do next time you present this speech, this expose, is to include in the transformation of thinking the Indian Act and the results it has had on Canadian society. Because that is a part that there's a hole in your presentation. There's a hole at the beginning where you're talking about how the laws evolved and how the question of domination evolved between the newcomers and the local residents, I will call them like that. And you begin at the end by talking about John Ralston Saul's take on what the country always was and has become. But there is not enough understanding or knowledge within Canadian society of the role of the Indian Act in the creation of the society that we now have. And please, I ask you to help to educate the population about that role. Thank you. Merci.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I appreciate these comments, and the comments go farther than just including some aspects of the First Nations, all behind all that, in the dominant society, we have a tendency to limit, as Ralston Saul said, to limit, simplify history to a few facts. I think that, as you've seen in the examples yesterday, that one of the responsibilities of the minority groups, the oppressed groups, is to not lose their history and always remember to a collective memory this history. And the comments going exactly in that direction. One of the responsibilities of the minority groups is to not to lose their history, which is a difficult one, a painful one, not always bring it forward as a victim, but to remind the minority groups, and to the minority groups too, in the dominant society, that this history is part of the past, and of the present too, which includes, obviously, the things you've mentioned. Okay, one last question.
I'm rather confused. I listened to this through here, and you're talking about citizenship and immigration and everything. When you sit back and listen to your presentation, it's like, we Métis are immigrants. We're not immigrants. We're the founders of Canada. But the message you're passing through here, if you don't listen carefully enough, it's like we are immigrants. We're not immigrants here.
No.
And you have to clarify that. And like Marie-Louise said, you have to clarify the Indian Act here. It has to be clear for us. And I believe that you owe us that clarity in your next presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry if it came across that way. I'm certainly will rework that. I'm not sure if I'll ever be asked to present it again. But I want you to be absolutely clear. I want to be absolutely clear here. The three pillars that we're talking about are First Nations, Inuit, Métis. Métis are not immigrants. They are this combination of civilizations. And then you have the European civilizations of French, English, and then we have the cultural communities that have developed through immigration. These are the three pillars of Canada. And this is where we have to find this convergence of some interests that will lead to a renewed citizenship and democracy.
I understand it, but because I followed it before, but I know just listening to you, and I understand what you're saying and everything, but if you look at the message you're throwing in and you bring in immigration, we're not immigrants. And it's, so that's why I'm just saying, just for future,
okay.
Please pay respect to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. We're going to conclude the discussion, wrap up the discussion, but you know that the second round table is going to begin in 5 minutes. We'll have a 10-minute break.
Take about 5 minutes before starting the second round table that will happen until the lunch. So just going to take 5 minutes to set up. And merci beaucoup, Wilfrid.
Plaisir.